Something is wrong with America. You can feel it. You felt it this morning when you drove past the third storefront in your strip mall that has been empty for a year. You felt it last week when your neighbor, the one you used to talk to every Saturday, told you he is putting his house on the market because he cannot afford the insurance anymore. You feel it every time you walk into a grocery store and the prices on the shelf do not match the number on your paycheck. You feel it in the silence on your street where children used to play. You feel it in the parking lot of the church that used to be full on Sundays and now has 30 cars where there used to be 200. And the thing that nobody is saying out loud, the thing I need you to hear me say right now, is that your neighbors feel it too. All of them, every single one. And none of you are talking about it because the feeling does not have a name. It is not a recession. It is not a depression. It is not inflation. It is not any single economic category. It is the sensation that something underneath everything else has shifted. Something structural, something permanent. And the data confirms what the feeling suggests. Something is profoundly, measurably, documentably wrong with America. And your neighbors know it. And today I am going to show you the evidence. Only 25% of young Americans talk to their neighbors now, and in 2012 it was 59%. 6 weeks ago, Fortune magazine published an article that should have been the most discussed piece of journalism in the country but was barely covered by anyone. The headline said America is becoming less neighborly and that the implications are economic, not just social. The American Enterprise Institute released a survey showing that only 25% of adults aged 18 to 29 say they talk with their neighbors at least a few times a week. In 2012, that number was 59%. Let that sink in. In 14 years, the percentage of young Americans who regularly speak to the people who live next to them has been cut by more than half, from nearly 6 in 10 to 1 in 4. And the decline is not limited to young people. It extends across every age group, every income level, every region. Americans of all ages are less likely to know their neighbors' names, less likely to borrow a tool or a cup of sugar, less likely to watch each other's houses, less likely to check on each other during a storm, less likely to share a meal, and less likely to have the kind of low-stakes, treated social interactions that sociologists call weak ties, but that are actually the strongest ties holding a community together. Because weak ties are the glue, they are the fabric. They are the reason you feel safe walking to your mailbox. The reason you trust that someone will call 911 if your house catches fire. The reason your children can ride their bikes around the block. The reason your packages do not get stolen from your porch. The reason you know that someone will notice if you do not come outside for 3 days. When the weak ties disappear, the community does not just become less friendly. It becomes less functional, less safe, less resilient, less able to absorb shocks, and less willing to invest in itself because nobody feels like they belong to anything worth investing in. And the Gallup poll that Fortune cited alongside the AEI data found something that connects the social collapse directly to the economic collapse. Americans who lack a collaborative community environment or reliable neighbors, defined as people they would turn to in times of hardship, are less likely to be doing well financially and less confident in their ability to navigate economic circumstances. The isolation is not just lonely, it is expensive. Because when you do not have neighbors you call a service. When you do not have a friend who can watch your kid for 2 hours, you pay a babysitter. When you do not have someone who can drive you to the airport, you pay for parking. When you do not have a community that shares tools, shares meals, shares rides, shares knowledge, every act of survival becomes a commercial transaction. And every commercial transaction takes money out of a household that does not have enough to begin with. The disappearance of neighborliness is not a cultural footnote, it is a cost of living multiplier that makes every other economic pressure worse. And there is a dimension of this that economists are only now beginning to quantify. A study published in the Journal of Economic Psychology found that social capital, the trust, reciprocity, and shared norms that exist within a community, is directly correlated with household financial resilience. Families embedded in dense social networks recover from financial shocks approximately 40% faster than families who lack those networks. They find new employment faster because personal connections generate more job leads than online applications. They access emergency resources faster because they know who in their community has information, tools, or temporary financial capacity. They negotiate better deals on everything from car repairs to medical bills because word-of-mouth reputation effects function as a form of consumer protection that no government agency can replicate. And they avoid predatory financial products because their social network includes someone who has experienced a payday loan, a title loan, or a debt trap and warns them away. When that social network disappears, the individual household is exposed to every predator in the marketplace without a buffer. The payday loan industry, which charges effective annual interest rates of 400 to 600%, targets neighborhoods with low social cohesion because isolated people are more likely to borrow from institutions that exploit them. Buy now, pay later services, which are increasingly used for groceries and essential purchases, target the same demographic. And the credit card industry, which charges average APRs of 22 to 23%, generates its highest profit margins from customers who carry balances, miss payments, and incur fees, which are disproportionately the customers who lack the social network that would help them avoid the debt spiral in the first place. The financial services industry profits from isolation. The sicker the community, the more profitable the extraction. And the extraction makes the community sicker. That is not an accident. It is a business model. And it is operating at maximum efficiency in the America of 2026 precisely because the social infrastructure that used to protect communities from predatory extraction has been dismantled. 41% of Americans are lonely, and 2/3 never participate in anything communal. In January 2026, a national survey on social connection found that 41% of Americans experience loneliness, 4 in 10. In the richest, most connected, most technologically networked country in the history of the world, 4 in 10 people are lonely. And the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy had already declared a formal epidemic of loneliness and isolation in 2023, calling it a public health crisis as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That comparison is not rhetorical. It is clinical. Loneliness increases the risk of heart disease by 29%, the risk of stroke by 32%, the risk of dementia among older adults by 50%, the risk of premature death by 26%. Those are not psychological effects. They are physiological effects. Loneliness changes the body. It raises cortisol levels. It weakens the immune system. It accelerates cognitive decline. It shortens life. And the national survey found something that the lead researcher, Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, said was more troubling than the loneliness number itself. More than 2/3 of Americans never participate in clubs or organizations. Not rarely. Never. She said. So what we're seeing is that not only do we have small social networks, but we're not interacting with them, and we're not engaged in our communities. Stevenson University's Research Center documented that time spent with friends in person has dropped by 20 hours per month since 2003. 20 hours. That is nearly an hour per day of face-to-face human contact that has disappeared from the average American's life in 2 decades. The number of people living alone has doubled since 1960, and the American Perspective Survey found that 49% of Americans have 3 or fewer close friends, up from 27% in 1990. 17% have no close friends at all. 0. In the core social network of nearly 1 in 5 Americans, there is no one, not a single person they would call in a crisis, confide in during a hard time, or share a meal with on a Tuesday evening. And the research from the Survey Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute documented that this civic decline has not affected all groups equally. Americans with a high school education or less are more likely to live in what the researchers call civic deserts, areas that lack the commercial places like coffee shops and public places like community centers, parks, and libraries that function as hubs of community connection. Timothy P. Carney, in his book Alienated America, wrote that associational life has become a high-end good that most people cannot access. Community has been privatized. Belonging has been commodified. And the people who can least afford to lose their social connections are the people who have lost them the fastest. Last week, Axios reported that the places where Americans used to gather are disappearing and nobody is replacing them. 7 days ago, on July 5th, Axios published a report on what sociologists call third places, the gathering spaces outside of home and work where community life happens. Bars, coffee shops, libraries, community centers, parks, barbershops, diners, churches. These are the places where neighbors become friends, where strangers become neighbors, where gossip carries useful information, where someone notices that the old man who always sat in the third booth has not been in for a week, and maybe someone should check on him. A 2025 research study led by Jessica Finlay at the University of Colorado Boulder found a rapid decline in third-place availability between 2019 and 2021 using census tract-level data, and the decline has continued since. Libraries have had their budgets cut across the country. Community centers have been defunded by municipalities under fiscal pressure. Parks have been allowed to deteriorate as maintenance budgets were redirected to cover pension obligations and debt service. Churches, which for generations served as the primary gathering space for American communities, have been emptying at a rate that would have been unthinkable 30 years ago. Gallup documented that church membership in the United States fell below 50% for the first time in 2020, down from 70% in 1990, a 20 percentage point decline in 2 decades. The Urban Institute detailed in 2024 how declining government funding for public spaces had left many dilapidated, underutilized, or privatized and no longer free. And affordability is compounding the problem. A growing number of Americans, particularly younger ones, cite rising costs as the reason they spend less time socializing outside their homes. When a cup of coffee costs $6, a beer costs $9, and parking costs $15, the casual social outing that used to cost nothing becomes a budget decision. And when budgets are already stretched past breaking, the social outing is the first thing that gets cut. Not because people do not want community, because they cannot afford it. The cost of being around other people has become a luxury expense in an economy where luxuries have been eliminated from the median household budget. And the spaces that used to be free, the park, the library, the community center, the church fellowship hall, are either gone, defunded, deteriorated, or occupied by people experiencing homelessness because there is nowhere else for them to go either. The third places are not declining because Americans decided they prefer isolation. They are declining because the economy that is supposed to support community life has been restructured to extract maximum value from every square foot of commercial and public space, and community value does not show up on a balance sheet. And the decline is quantifiable in ways that most reporting has missed. Between 2019 and 2023, the number of independent restaurants in the United States declined by approximately 72,000, according to National Restaurant Association data. Those were not chain restaurants. They were the diners, the pizza joints, the family-owned breakfast spots where the waitress knew your name and the cook knew your order. Each one was a third place. Each closure removed a gathering point that cannot be replaced by a DoorDash delivery. The barbershop, one of the last remaining third places in many lower-income neighborhoods, is also under pressure from rising commercial rents, insurance costs, and licensing fees. And the barbershop was not just where you got your hair cut. It was where you heard about job openings, where fathers brought their sons, where older men told stories and younger men listened, where the social knowledge of the neighborhood was transmitted across generations. The economic value of a barbershop conversation cannot be measured. The economic cost of its absence It costs exactly what happens when a 22-year-old has no older man to tell him about the apprenticeship at the electrical union, no one to introduce him to the foreman at the construction site. That 22-year-old ends up on an app looking for gig work instead of in a trade, learning a skill that compounds over 40 years. The lifetime earnings difference between a skilled tradesman and a gig worker is approximately $800,000. One barbershop conversation, $800,000 in lifetime earnings, and the barbershop is closed, and the 22-year-old is scrolling alone in his apartment, and the foreman cannot find apprentices because nobody sent them his way, and the mall that replaced the downtown but replaced the town square has itself been abandoned. A monument to the idea that commerce could substitute for community. It cannot. Commerce serves the individual transaction. Community serves the collective relationship. And when you replace every communal space with a commercial space, and then the commercial space fails because nobody can afford the commercial prices, you are left with neither commerce nor community. Just empty buildings and full screens, and the vague feeling that something is wrong that nobody can name because the language for what was lost was stored in the places where people used to gather, and those places are gone. Robert Putnam warned us 25 years ago, and every single thing he predicted got worse. In the year 2000, Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam published a book called Bowling Alone: The Collapse and Revival of American Community. The title came from a simple observation. More Americans were bowling than ever before, but bowling league membership had plummeted. People were still showing up to the lanes. They were just showing up alone. And Putnam used that image as a metaphor for a broader collapse in civic participation that he documented across dozens of indicators. Membership in service organizations was declining. Membership in veterans groups was declining. Membership in fraternal organizations was declining. Membership in scouting was declining. Membership in parent-teacher associations was declining. Voter turnout was declining. Dinner parties were declining. Card games with neighbors were declining. The entire infrastructure of American community life, the clubs, the leagues, the lodges, the churches, the neighborhood associations, the civic organizations that had defined small-town and suburban American life for a century, was hollowing out. That was 2000. 25 years later, in December 2025, Fortune published a retrospective analysis documenting that every single trend Putnam identified has accelerated. Americans are less likely to join civic groups, unions, and churches than in recent generations. They have fewer friends. They are less trusting of each other. They are less likely to hang out at a local bar or coffee shop. And the decline has continued despite the rise of social media, which was supposed to connect people but has instead replaced deep, sustained, in-person relationships with shallow, intermittent, screen-mediated interactions that research consistently shows do not reduce loneliness and may increase it. Putnam wrote a follow-up book in 2020 called The Upswing, in which he and co-author Shaylin Romney Garrett documented that the decline in civic participation, social trust, and community engagement is part of a longer cycle in American history. They traced the arc from the Gilded Age of the late 19th century through the Progressive Era and the community-building decades of the mid-20th century to the current decline that began in the 1960s and has accelerated every decade since. The arc describes a society that built itself up from extreme individualism and inequality into a period of collective solidarity and shared prosperity, and then dismantled everything it built over the following 60 years. We are living at the bottom of the arc, the point of maximum disconnection. The point where the social fabric that previous generations wove has been unraveled to the individual thread. And the consequences are visible in every data set, every survey, every emergency room, every foreclosure notice, every suicide statistic, every empty church pew, and every neighborhood where the houses stand close together, but the people inside them have never met. And Putnam's research contains a finding that is rarely discussed but may be the most important insight in the entire field of social capital research. He found that social trust, the generalized belief that most people can be trusted, peaked in America around 1960, when approximately 55% of Americans agreed with the statement, "Most people can be trusted." By 2023, that number had fallen to approximately 30%. Less than 1 in 3 Americans believes that most people can be trusted. And the decline in generalized trust maps almost perfectly onto the decline in community participation. Because trust is not an abstract philosophical position. It is a practical resource that is generated by repeated interactions with other human beings in contexts where cooperation is expected and reciprocity is the norm. You trust your neighbors because you have borrowed their lawnmower and returned it. You trust the people at your church because you have served on a committee together and seen them follow through on their commitments. You trust the parents at your children's school because you have organized events together and shared the work. Trust is produced by proximity and practice. When proximity disappears and practice ceases, trust evaporates, and when trust evaporates, every transaction becomes more expensive because every transaction requires verification, contracts, lawyers, inspections, reviews, ratings, background checks, and the entire infrastructure of distrust that has become the dominant feature of American commercial and social life. The sharing economy is not actually sharing. It is renting access to strangers' property through a platform that provides the trust verification that communities used to provide for free. Airbnb exists because you do not trust strangers, and strangers do not trust you, so a corporation mediates the relationship for a 15% fee. TaskRabbit exists because you do not have a neighbor you can ask for help, so a corporation finds you a stranger and takes a cut. Care.com exists because you do not know anyone in your community who can watch your children, so a corporation runs a background check and charges a subscription. Every platform that promises to connect people is actually profiting from the disconnection that created the market for connection in the first place. The trillion-dollar platform economy is built on the ruins of American community, and every dollar that flows through those platforms is a dollar that used to flow through a relationship, a handshake, a favor returned, a debt of gratitude that was never monetized because the currency it was denominated in was trust, not dollars. That economy is gone. And the economy that replaced it charges a fee for every connection that used to be free. Your neighbors are not talking to you because they are drowning, and drowning people do not make small talk. Here is the connection that nobody is making between the economic data and the social data, and I need you to understand it because it explains why your street feels different than it did 10 years ago. Your neighbors are not ignoring you because they are rude. They are not unfriendly because they do not care. They are not avoiding eye contact in the driveway because they dislike you. They are exhausted. They are working 50 hours a week at a job that pays them 15% less in real terms than the same job paid in 2000. They are coming home to bills that consume 100% of their income. They are spending their evenings on the phone with their insurance company trying to understand why a $3,500 deductible still leaves them with a $1,200 bill. They are lying awake at 2 a.m. calculating whether they can afford the car repair that the mechanic quoted them at $1,800. They are choosing between the prescription and the groceries. They are telling their children that they cannot afford summer camp this year. They are Googling how to lower property taxes and hardship withdrawal 401k and food banks near me at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. And when they come outside to get the mail and you wave, they wave back. But they do not stop and talk. Not because they do not want to, because they do not have the emotional bandwidth to perform the social ritual of being okay when they are not okay. And admitting they are not okay to a neighbor feels dangerous, because admitting it makes it real. And making it real in front of someone who might be judging them, who might be doing fine, who might think less of them, is a vulnerability that a drowning person cannot afford. So they wave, they smile, they go inside, and you stand in your driveway and feel the distance and wonder what happened to your neighborhood. What happened is that the economy broke your neighbors, the same economy that broke you, and neither of you is talking about it, because the shame of struggling in the richest country on earth is more powerful than the relief of admitting it out loud. McKinsey's Q4 2025 survey found that 29% of American adults dipped into savings in the last 3 months. Another 29% reduced their savings rate. 28% are using credit cards more. The Century Foundation found that 34% skipped a meal in the past year. 29% delayed medical care due to cost. And these are not numbers about the poor. These are numbers about Americans. The median, the middle, the people on your street, and they are all going through it. And none of them are talking about it. And the silence is making every one of them feel more alone. And the loneliness is making every one of them sicker, more anxious, more depressed, more financially vulnerable, and less able to withstand the next shock that the economy delivers. The isolation and the economic pressure are feeding each other in a loop that gets tighter every month. And the loop has a name in public health research. It is called the social determinants of health spiral. When economic stress increases, social participation decreases because people withdraw from activities that cost money, energy, or emotional capacity. When social participation decreases, health outcomes worsen because the protective effects of community, the stress buffering, the information sharing, the accountability, the motivation, the simple human contact that reminds the body it is not in survival mode, disappear. When health outcomes worsen, economic capacity decreases further because medical costs increase, work productivity declines, and chronic conditions accumulate that limit employment options. When economic capacity decreases, social withdrawal deepens, and the spiral continues, downward. And at every turn of the spiral, the cost of intervention increases, while the probability of intervention decreases. The community that could have caught someone at the first turn of the spiral, when they missed a bowling night, when they stopped coming to church, when they did not show up for the neighborhood barbecue, does not exist anymore. The catch happens at the emergency room now, or it does not happen at all. And the cost of catching someone at the emergency room is 50 to 100 times the cost of catching them at the bowling alley. But the bowling alley is closed, the church is empty. The neighborhood barbecue stopped happening 5 years ago because nobody organized it because nobody knew their neighbors well enough to send the invitation. And 29% of Americans dipped into savings last quarter, while 34% skipped a meal, while 29% delayed medical care, while 41% reported loneliness, while consumer sentiment hit the lowest level in 75 years. Those numbers are not measuring 5 different problems. They are measuring one problem at 5 different points on the spiral. The problem is disconnection. And the disconnection is destroying America from the inside out, one household at a time, one empty church pew at a time, one unanswered door at a time, one neighbor who used to wave and now goes straight inside at a time. Something broke in 2020, and it was not the economy, it was the last thread of social trust holding America together. The pandemic did not create the isolation. Robert Putnam documented that it started in the 1960s. But the pandemic severed the last remaining threads of community connection that had survived 6 decades of gradual erosion. Before March 2020, Americans who did not join clubs or attend church or volunteer still had offices, they had break rooms, they had water cooler conversations, they had the involuntary social contact that comes from physically being in the same space as other human beings for 8 hours a day. The pandemic eliminated that. Remote work removed 30 to 40% of the American workforce from the physical proximity of their colleagues. And that removal was supposed to be temporary. It became permanent. A resume builder survey found that 1/4 of remote workers said their social skills had declined since setting up a home office. They are not just working from home, they are deteriorating from home. The muscles of social interaction, the ability to read body language, to sustain eye contact, to navigate the micro-negotiations of shared physical space are atrophying from disuse. And the people who returned to offices that had changed. Cubicle layouts replaced shared work areas. Hot desking eliminated the personal space that made people feel rooted. Open floor plans were redesigned for distancing. The casual lunch invitation, the hallway conversation, the birthday cake in the break room, these rituals that seem trivial are actually the infrastructure of workplace community. And much of that infrastructure was dismantled during the pandemic and never rebuilt. And outside the workplace, the pandemic accelerated every trend that was already underway. Church attendance dropped further and has not recovered. Community organizations that suspended meetings in 2020 discovered that their members did not come back in 2021 or 2022 or 2023 or 2024 or 2025. Volunteer rates plummeted and have only partially recovered. And the people who were already on the edge of social isolation before the pandemic, the elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, the people in rural areas with limited mobility, were pushed into complete isolation for months or years. Many of them never emerged. Not because they died, although hundreds of thousands did, but because the effort of re-entering a social world that had restructured itself around their absence was too great for people whose energy was already depleted by age, illness, or poverty. They stayed home, they stayed alone, they stayed invisible, and nobody noticed, because in a society where 67% of people never participate in any communal activity, nobody notices when one more person stops showing up. There is no roll call, there is no attendance sheet. There is no one whose job it is to count the people who used to be present and are not anymore. And I want to tell you about what was lost in specific terms, because the aggregate numbers do not convey the texture of what disappeared. In 2019, there were approximately 380,000 congregations in the United States. By 2025, approximately 4,500 were closing every year, a rate that has accelerated from the pre-pandemic average of 3,000 per year. Each closure eliminates not just a worship space, but a community kitchen that feeds the elderly, a meeting hall that hosts support groups, a bulletin board where neighbors post help-wanted signs and babysitting offers, a parking lot where teenagers learn to drive, a Sunday school where children learn to share, and an implicit social contract that says someone in this building cares whether you show up next week. When a Walmart closes, the community loses a store. When a church closes, the community loses itself. And the civic organizations that used to fill the spaces between church and work have suffered the same trajectory. The Elks, the Moose, the VFW, the Rotary, the Lions Club, the Knights of Columbus, the PTA. Each of these organizations was, in its practical function, a mutual aid network disguised as a social club. Members helped each other find jobs, navigate bureaucracies, weather illnesses, bury their dead, and raise each other's children. The dues were nominal, the benefits were immeasurable, and participation in nearly every one of them has declined by 50 to 80% since their peaks in the 1960s and 1970s. The infrastructure of American community was not destroyed by a single event. It was defunded, deprioritized, outcompeted by commercial alternatives that captured the time and attention that used to be donated to communal life, and finally abandoned by a population that was too economically stressed and too digitally distracted to maintain the institutions their grandparents had built. The buildings still stand in many cases. The Eagles Lodge on Main Street, the Masonic Temple on the corner, the community center by the park. They stand empty or repurposed. Monuments to a version of American life that the current economy cannot sustain, and the current culture does not value. And the people who remember what those spaces felt like, what it meant to belong to something, what it meant to be known by name in a room full of neighbors, are watching the emptiness spread and wondering whether their grandchildren will ever experience what they had. They will not. Not unless something fundamental changes, and nothing fundamental is changing. Loneliness is now a leading cause of death in America, and it does not appear on a single death certificate. The Surgeon General's advisory on loneliness and isolation cited research showing that the mortality impact of social disconnection is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes per day and greater than the mortality impact of obesity. Greater than obesity. In a country where obesity-related health conditions cost the healthcare system approximately $173 billion per year, loneliness is killing more people and receiving a fraction of the attention, a fraction of the funding, and a fraction of the policy response. And the reason loneliness does not receive the attention it deserves is that it does not appear on a death certificate. Nobody dies of loneliness the way they die of a heart attack or a stroke. Loneliness kills indirectly. It kills through the hypertension that develops when cortisol levels remain chronically elevated. It kills through the cardiovascular disease that accelerates when the body's inflammatory response is permanently activated by the stress of isolation. It kills through the alcoholism that develops when the only available coping mechanism is a bottle. It kills through the opioid addiction that fills the void where human connection used to be. It kills through the suicide that ends the pain when the pain of being alone becomes unbearable. And it kills through the medical neglect that occurs when there is nobody in your life who notices that you have lost weight, that your color has changed, that your cough has persisted for 3 months, that you have stopped leaving the house, that the prescriptions on your counter have not been refilled. The person who lives alone and has no close friends and does not talk to their neighbors and does not attend any communal gathering is a person whose health decline is invisible until it becomes an emergency. And the emergency room is the most expensive, least effective point of intervention in the entire healthcare system. The ER treats the crisis. It does not treat the isolation that caused the crisis. And the patient is discharged back into the same isolation, where the same cycle begins again until the next emergency, or the last one. And the cost of this cycle is staggering. The National Academy of Medicine estimated that social isolation among older adults costs the Medicare system approximately $6.7 billion per year in additional healthcare spending. Isolated seniors have higher rates of hospitalization, longer hospital stays, higher rates of readmission, and higher rates of nursing home placement. Every one of those outcomes is more expensive than the community-based interventions that could prevent them. A weekly phone call from a volunteer, a daily meal delivered with a conversation, a monthly visit from a community health worker, a ride to the doctor, a knock on the door. These interventions cost dollars. The emergency room visit they prevent costs thousands. The nursing home placement they delay costs tens of thousands. The premature death they avert is priceless. And the American healthcare system, which is optimized for crisis intervention rather than prevention, for billing rather than caring, for treating individuals rather than supporting communities, does none of them at scale. Because community health does not generate revenue. Loneliness does not have a billing code. And the pharmaceutical industry, which funds the research, the lobbying, and the advertising that drives American healthcare policy, cannot sell a pill for the feeling that nobody knows you are alive. And the crisis is not confined to the elderly. The Surgeon General issued a separate advisory on the youth mental health crisis, documenting that rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidality among American adolescents have risen dramatically since 2010. Teen girls report the highest levels of persistent sadness and hopelessness in the history of the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and the youth mental health crisis is occurring against the same backdrop of community dissolution that is driving the adult loneliness epidemic. Children no longer play in the neighborhood the way they did 30 years ago. Organized activities have replaced spontaneous play, and organized activities cost money and require transportation, which excludes the families that cannot afford either. The walk to a friend's house has been replaced by the screen in the bedroom. The pickup basketball game at the park has been replaced by the video game console. The after-school hangout at the local shop has been replaced by the group chat that is simultaneously connected and isolating, present but not proximate, social but not sociable. And the parents of these children are too exhausted from working to compensate for the community that no longer exists. They cannot organize the block party because they do not know their neighbors. They cannot send their children outside because the neighborhood does not feel safe, because there are no eyes on the street, because nobody is outside, because everyone is inside, because there is nothing outside to go to, because the third places are gone. The spiral operates at every age. The child is isolated. The teenager is depressed. The young adult has no close friends. The middle-aged parent is too exhausted to connect. The retiree is alone in a house on a street where nobody checks on them. Each generation is experiencing the same disconnection at different stages of life. And each generation assumes their experience is personal rather than systemic because there is nobody to compare notes with. What your neighbors know that the economists do not is that the numbers stopped at describing their lives a long time ago. Consumer sentiment fell to 47.6 in early April, the lowest reading in 75 years. And the economists who study sentiment were surprised. Because by their models, sentiment should not be that low. GDP is still growing, unemployment is low, wages are up in nominal terms, the stock market is near historic highs, by the textbook indicators the economy is performing adequately, and 47.6 is not adequately. 47.6 is despair, and the disconnect between the models and the measurement is the most important economic signal in America right now because it tells you that the models are measuring the wrong things. GDP measures total output. It does not measure who receives the output. Unemployment measures whether you have a job. It does not measure whether the job pays enough to live. Wages measure nominal increases. They do not measure whether the increase covers the cost increases that arrived at the same time. The stock market measures the value of financial assets. It does not measure the financial condition of the 50% of Americans who own no stocks at all. The models describe an economy, the people describe a life, and the life does not match the economy. And your neighbors know this. They know it not because they read the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, they know it because they live it. They know the grocery bill went up $400 a month. They know the insurance went up $200 a month. They know the rent went up $300 a month. They know the gas went from $2.90 to $4.26. They know the daycare went from $900 to $1,100. They know the deductible went from $1,500 to $3,500. They know the property tax reassessment added $1,400 a year. They know the car payment went from $450 to $750 because the car prices went up 32% and the interest rate doubled. They know all of this. They live all of this, every day, every month, every bill, and when the economist says the economy is growing, and the politician says inflation is under control, and the news anchor says consumer spending is resilient, your neighbor hears words that do not describe their reality. And the gap between the words and the reality is the gap that is destroying social trust, civic participation, institutional confidence, and community connection. Because when the official description of the world does not match your lived experience of the world, you stop trusting the people who are describing it. And when you stop trusting the people who are describing it, you stop trusting the institutions they represent. And when you stop trusting the institutions, you stop participating in the civic life that the institutions are supposed to facilitate. And when you stop participating, the community dissolves. And when the community dissolves, you are alone. And when you are alone, you are fragile. And when you are fragile, the next economic shock does not hit a community that can absorb it together. It hits 330 million individuals, one at a time, in houses where nobody is coming to check on them, on streets where nobody knows their name, in a country where something is wrong and everyone can feel it and nobody is talking about it. And the political system has no mechanism for fixing this, because the political system is itself a product of the disconnection. Campaigns are run on screens, not at town halls. Candidates communicate through algorithms, not handshakes. Donors communicate priorities through wire transfers, not community meetings. The political system in 2026 is designed to identify what isolated individuals want to hear and deliver it through a feed, which is the opposite of what community requires. Community requires listening. Community requires compromise. Community requires showing up in the same room as people you disagree with and figuring out how to share a space. The American political system has been optimized for the opposite. It identifies disagreements and amplifies them because amplified disagreements generate engagement, and engagement generates advertising revenue, and advertising revenue funds campaigns, and campaigns produce elected officials who are indebted to the revenue model that elected them. The political system is not failing to build community. It is succeeding at destroying it, because destroying community is profitable. Isolated individuals consume more media, click more ads, donate more to emotional appeals, and vote based on fear rather than information. An engaged community with strong social bonds, high trust, and regular in-person communication is the worst possible audience for the modern political apparatus. Those people talk to each other. They compare notes. They reach consensus through conversation rather than through cable news. They hold representatives accountable through relationships rather than donations. The political industry does not want that. The media industry does not want that. The platform economy does not want that. And the financial services industry does not want that. Every industry that profits from the American consumer profits more when that consumer is alone. And every one of them is getting exactly what they want. And the 330 million Americans who are living inside this system are producing the loneliness data, the trust collapse data, the civic participation data, and the consumer sentiment data that confirms the system is working perfectly. Not for them, for the people who built it. And the thing I want to leave you with is this. Your neighbors know it. The feeling you have is not paranoia. It is not anxiety. It is not a personal failing. It is the accurate perception of a society that is coming apart at the seams, measured by every survey, documented by every researcher, confirmed by every dataset, and experienced by every household on your street, whether they admit it or not. The 25% who still talk to their neighbors are not the normal ones holding on to a dying tradition. They are the survivors of a communal infrastructure that the rest of America has already lost. And the 75% who do not talk to their neighbors are not antisocial. They are the product of an economy that extracted their time, their energy, their savings, their health, and their capacity for human connection, and left them with nothing but a screen and a silence that nobody breaks. Something is wrong with America. Your neighbors know it. You know it. The surveys know it. The Surgeon General knows it. Robert Putnam knew it 25 years ago. And the 41% who told researchers they are lonely know it better than anyone. The question is not whether something is wrong. The evidence is unanimous. The question is what happens to a country of 330 million people when the social bonds that held them together dissolve entirely and the only connection they have left is the algorithmic feed that profits from their isolation, the political apparatus that profits from their division, and the commercial system that profits from their loneliness by selling them products to fill the void where community used to be. That is the experiment America is running, and your neighborhood is the laboratory, and the results, so far, are exactly what every civilization that lost its social cohesion has produced. Fragmentation, distrust, despair, decline. Share this video with the neighbor you used to talk to. Share it with the friend you have not called in 6 months. Share it with the person in your life who you know is struggling but who has not said it out loud because the silence has become more comfortable than the truth. Something is wrong with America. And the only thing worse than knowing it is knowing it alone. And if you do one thing after watching this video, let it be this. Walk outside, find a neighbor, any neighbor, and ask them how they are actually doing. Not the polite version, the real version. Because there is a 41% chance they are lonely, a 34% chance they skipped a meal this year, a 29% chance they delayed medical care they needed, and a 100% chance they are feeling the same thing you are feeling. The thing that brought you to this video, the unnamed sense that something is wrong with the country you grew up in, and nobody around you seems willing to say it. Say it to your neighbor, because the research is clear, the single most powerful intervention against loneliness, against financial fragility, against institutional distrust, against civic decline, against every trend I documented in this video, is the restoration of a single human connection. One conversation, one check-in, one meal shared, one door knocked on. It does not fix the economy, it does not fix the institutions, it does not fix the infrastructure, but it fixes the isolation that makes every other problem worse, and it is free, and it starts on your street, and it starts today. And nobody is going to organize it for you, because the organizations that used to organize it are gone. You are the organization now. Your block is the community now. And the question is whether you will let the disconnection define the next 25 years the way it defined the last 25, or whether you will walk outside and knock on a door. Something is wrong with America. Your neighbors know it. Now you know they know it. And that shared knowledge, spoken out loud between two people standing in a driveway, is the first thread of a fabric that 330 million Americans need to start weaving again before there is nothing left to weave.